All right. Well, I guess we'll get started as people start trickling in from the waiting room. Thank you all so much for being here with us tonight. My name is Holly, and I'm the programs coordinator at the Osgood Township Museum. In addition to our speaker tonight, we'll also be joined by our executive director, James, and our collections officer, Sarah, who will be assisting in tonight's presentation on the tech side of things. So the Osgood Township Museum acknowledges that our museum, located in Vernon, Ontario, just south of Ottawa, is on the traditional unceded ancestral land of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Algonquin Anishinaabe are the original inhabitants of this territory along the Ottawa, Rideau, and Castor rivers and have lived on this land since time immemorial. We are grateful to be gathering here tonight to share stories as generations before us also have. So if you've never been to the museum before, the Osgood Sorry about that. If you've never been to the museum before, the Osgood Township Museum tells the story of Ottawa's agricultural and rural heritage in the former Osgood Township. We are open all year and currently planning our spring and summer program offerings. But before the warmer weather comes our way, which I'm sure a lot of us are hoping for will come very soon, we do have a few late winter programs coming up that I just wanted to mention briefly. So we will be running our March break programming from Monday, March 10th to Friday, March 14th. It'll be a drop-in style, very casual with rotating activities throughout the week, and there'll be more details coming soon on our website. Our next museum talk will also be on March 20th, looking at the fascinating history of Irish stick fighting, and registration will soon be coming to Eventbrite. And lastly, in the next few weeks, we'll have a few of Steve's books available for sale at the museum if you'd like to swing by and grab a copy. And while you're there, you can also check out our newest mini exhibit featuring some of the museum's baseball-related artifacts. So all a very themed evening tonight. So finally, as we get into the presentation, I'll be moderating the chat. So if you have any questions, don't hesitate to type them up, and I'll relay them to Steve at the end during the Q&A. And to introduce our speaker tonight, Steve Rennie is a baseball writer and researcher who lives in Ottawa. A former journalist who covered Canadian politics from Parliament Hill for nearly a decade, his reporting garnered him 2 National Newspaper Awards and 3 Canadian Association of Journalists Award nominations. Among a number of international assignments, he spent a total of 6 months between 2008 and 2011 covering the war in Afghanistan. He has reported from every Canadian province and territory, with a particularly memorable assignment aboard an icebreaker traversing part of the Northwest Passage. He is the president of the Ottawa-Gatineau and Eastern Ontario chapter for the Society of American Baseball Research, otherwise known as SABR, SABR. In the spring of 2024, he presented on Ottawa's early baseball history at the Frederick Ivor Campbell 19th Century Baseball Conference in Cooperstown, New York. He has a particular interest in 19th century baseball in Canada and enjoys unearthing long-forgotten games and teams from the sport's early history for the Centre for Canadian Baseball Research in Protowall. And now I will pass the virtual mic to Steve to tell us more about baseball history in Ottawa.
Okay, so we'll just jump right in. So a lot of people may not realize this about Ottawa, but we've been playing baseball in the city and surrounding areas for since at least 1865, and probably even longer than that, to be honest with you. But I think a lot of times when we talk about baseball in Canada, a lot of the focus tends to be on Southern Ontario, where there's a very long history of the game being played. And you know that typically is what we think of when we talk about baseball in Canada. But Ottawa actually has a really long and pretty decorated baseball history too. So I'm really excited today to be able to tell you about that because I think it's a kind of an underlooked but probably very interesting part of our baseball history here. So before we jump in, I want to just I know not everybody is necessarily a baseball historian or a baseball fan, so I thought I'd run through some high level timelines of the sport just to get everybody up to speed. So in the 1700s and all the way up into the 1830s, there's different reports of bat and ball games happening. And there's references as early as 1744 to a game called baseball, so base with a hyphen ball. And then various accounts of different ball and stick games that have been played in Europe, so in Germany, in France, and in England, and then of course in North America, so Canada and the United States. And fast forward to 1838, 1839, there are a couple of reports of early games being played. So there's a game played in Canada that's goes back to June of 1838, and I can talk a little bit about that in a second. And then a year later is the date that they put for the since debunked story about Abner Doubleday inventing baseball in Cooperstown, New York. So maybe I'll just pause on those for a second and just give a little bit of context. So for the first recorded Canadian baseball game in Beachville, this account came about 48 years after the fact. So a gentleman named Adam Ford had recounted the story of a game of baseball being played. He would have been 7 years old when the game was played. So fast forward almost 50 years, he's recounting this game that was played in June of 1838 in really specific detail, like to the dimensions of the field, the names of the players. So really, really specific. So there have been some questions about sort of the veracity of that, but there's nothing to suggest it didn't happen. It's just there's no other source other than him coming and saying, 48 years ago, I remember this game of baseball being played in Beachville. But it's sort of held up as the first game recorded here in Canada. The Doubleday one is just complete fabrication. Abner Doubleday didn't invent baseball. He wasn't even living in Cooperstown in 1839, but it was sort of invented much later after the fact to help support the idea that baseball was a uniquely American creation, which, there's some argument that it could be, and it sort of evolved up from different things. 1845 is when we see Alexander Cartwright publish a series of rules for the Knickerbocker Club of New York. These are sort of the first published set of rules for baseball, but they're almost certainly not invented by the Knickerbocker Club. It's more likely that the Knickerbocker Club was just the only ones that happened to record these rules, or that they were maybe the only ones that were preserved. But by the 1850s, baseball is really starting to become a very popular pastime, particularly in the New York area, so around New York City, Brooklyn, and it's really starting to take off as a very popular sport. As an aside, it's also very popular at this point in St. John, New Brunswick. So we see lots of reports from even there's some as early as the 1830s of baseball being played in St. John. Probably more something called town ball, which is a sort of a variant of baseball, but definitely a lot of early history there that links it to baseball. We get to 1860, and there's a game that's played, the first international game that we've been able to document in what's now Niagara Falls, was then called Clifton, between the Queen City Club of Buffalo and the Burlington Club of Hamilton, that was played. And as you'll see a little bit later in the presentation, this is only a few weeks before another international game that happened in between Prescott and Ogdensburg. So just to put a pin on that, Ottawa's baseball history in the surrounding areas of Ottawa does stretch back quite far, and we're not far off from this first international game either. By 1869, the Cincinnati Red Stockings are the first openly professional club to be operating, and they go on tours all around the United States and Canada, playing teams and barnstorming, and really making a name for themselves. And by 1871, that signals the end of the amateur era. Now we're into the professional era of baseball. So that's just a bit of a very high level timeline of baseball in the 1800s. So you can't talk about baseball without talking about the railways, because you can trace the spread of baseball to the spread of the rail systems across North America, and certainly Ottawa and the surrounding areas are no different. So in 1850, there's the Bytown and Prescott Railway is chartered. So construction begins, and it's kind of a lengthy track that will run basically from Ottawa straight down to Prescott, making stops in places like Kemptville and other places. By 1855, we now have regular train service between Ottawa and Prescott. And you can see there's an ad that I was able to find from the time that just shows what the schedule would have been like. So you can see there's stops in Gloucester and Osgood and Kemptville and Oxford Station and Spencerville and all the rest. It would have been about a 3-hour trip on the train at that time to go from Ottawa to Prescott. And then if you wanted to go further east out to Montreal or to even Boston or New York, you would have to transfer. You take the ferry across to Ogdensburg. You'd then take another train out east, and then you could get there either the next day or later that same evening if you were just heading to Montreal. So This you'll see in a second about my hypothesis is baseball spread to Ottawa from upstate New York, and I think the railways probably had a big part in that. So talking about upstate New York, the first documented game I was able to find in Ogdensburg, so just across the river from Prescott, would have been in June of 1860. So these between two local clubs, the Star and the St. Lawrence clubs in Ogdensburg. But of course, it wasn't very long after that before we started seeing international games. So in September of 1860, so this would have been less than a month now after that first international game I talked about earlier, a team called the Greenville Baseball Club in the newspapers, but it's more than likely the Grenville Baseball Club. I think it would have been just a typo in the newspaper. They played a club called the Empire Club, and they won in a 3-inning game by a score of 23-16. So this was, again, pretty typical of the time. You see very, very high scores around this period in baseball history, and a lot of that is because the fielders did not have gloves, so they were catching it with their hands. And this included the catcher as well. So you can imagine some of the mangled fingers that some of these people would have from trying to catch a ball with their bare hands. So it really did kind of favor the batter. The other thing was pitching at that point was much different than pitching now. So pitching now is primarily a defensive thing. So you're trying to strike out the batter. Back then, it was more sort of like you would play baseball with your kid and you lob them the baseball, and the batter would have virtually as much time as they wanted to try to hit the ball, so they could sit there and they had the option of waiting, for a pitch that they really liked, and then they'd be able to hit it. So you see these really, really high scores in the games from back then. So now baseball in the Ottawa area comes in around 1865. So the first reported incidence of baseball was at a picnic in Metcalfe in September of 1865. And this would have been at a Sons of Temperance picnic that was held that fall. And at the picnic, there's all kinds of different activities going on. So there's food, there's different activities. So there's sporting events. So that includes, they listed a few here. So there's cricket and baseball, there's wheelbarrow, there's sack races, different kinds of games that people were playing. And then, there's this mention, very obscure mention of baseball. There's also a mention later on in the same article about another game of ball being played by a group of ladies, and they say alone. So it's not really clear if that's them playing baseball or some sort of other bat and ball type game, but it may have also been, and probably more likely, describing some completely different game that they were playing. But this is interesting because it really does start to show that baseball is now coming to the Ottawa area. And there's a couple of interesting things about this particular reference. The first is that they don't have to explain what baseball is. So they assume that readers of the newspaper from 1865 in Ottawa knew what baseball is. So there could be a couple of reasons for that. It could be because baseball is already happening in other parts of North America. So it's possible that they're familiar with reading about these other games being played, although there's very few, if any, references to baseball prior to this in the Ottawa newspapers. And there's no description of sort of the rules or how it was played. It's just sort of listed as along with all these other activities that they assume the reader would be familiar with. So it does tell you that baseball was probably happening before 1865 in Ottawa. Just a lot of times, it being recorded really depends on who was playing it and whether it was sort of deemed worthy of reporting on. So in this case, you had all these folks from the Sons of Temperance picnic, and it was a big event, and it's certainly mentioned there. The first baseball club in Ottawa was formed 2 years later in 1867. And this would have been the same year that the Dominion of Canada was formed. And so the team called itself the New Dominion Baseball Club. And they, from all accounts, these are gentlemen who've, very new to the sport, not a lot of experience playing it, as you can see from the score here in their game against Ogdensburg. But what happened was they formed a team in the summer of 1867, and they decided to go down to Ogdensburg to play a game against the team there. And they were completely obliterated. You can see the high score of 141-20. So they did manage to score 20 runs, which is not nothing. But the newspaper does sort of indicate that they were not very well versed in the rules of the game. So they mentioned that they made some mistakes. They got out several times when maybe they shouldn't have. But they do mention sort of the athleticism of the players, and if they had more practice, they would get better. And so they kind of forecast that, in a year we'd like to see them again and see how they fare. The next year, 1868, the New Dominion Club is very clearly the city's preeminent baseball club. It's got a very large membership, so 60 players. It's considered the largest club in Ottawa, although there's not very many other clubs at the time. They had an office at the Ottawa Skating and Curling Club, which was on Albert Street, right downtown now, and they played their games in a field that was right behind the curling club and the skating club. So they're very popular. They don't have a lot of people to play against, though. So you can see here I've got some clippings of different games they played against. A lot of times they played against themselves, so they kind of split, 9 versus 9, and they would have sort of inter squad games. They played a game against the Ogdensburg team again, and then they had a little more success, but they still ended up losing the game. They had they played against a group of mechanics who had formed a team. They played against the Ottawa Cricket Club. So they played a series of 4 games with a cricket club where 2 of the games were baseball and 2 of the games were cricket. And predictably, they did well in the baseball games, and also predictably, they lost very badly in the cricket games. So you can kind of see some of the write-ups here, and you can see some of the higher scores. So the club doesn't last very long. By the end of 1868, there's virtually no mention anymore of the New Dominion Club. There was one reference to a game in 1869 that they may or may not have played. There's no kind of account of the result of the game, just that they were supposed to play it. But after that, for all intents and purposes, they disappear. And so it's kind of a mystery. So what happens to the New Dominion Club? Well, it's revealed in the newspaper, 3 years later, that they basically they lost their grounds because it was broken up and subdivided and sold into lots, and so they had nowhere to meet and nowhere to play, and so they just went defunct. So that's kind of a very anticlimactic end to the city's first club. But a lot of people from that baseball club went on to form a new team called the Ottawa Baseball Club. The Ottawa Baseball Club is formed in 1871. Like I said, with a number of members of the New Dominion Club are part of this new club. And they, in 1872, they leased 10 acres of land in was then known as Stewarton, which was its own sort of village at the south. What was then the south end of Ottawa. Today would be sort of in the Golden Triangle. And so you may actually be familiar with some of these street names. Some have changed, but you can see there Flora, even though that's no longer Flora isn't there any, like that Flora that you see in this map is not where Flora Street is now. Flora is now sort of between Bank and Bronson, but here you've got it between Elgin and Cartier essentially. And some of the names have changed, and the reason why some of these names are the way they are was because William Stewart was the landowner who lived very closely to where the Museum of Nature now stands, and so Stewarton was named after William Stewart. And many of the streets in the area were named after his children. So McLeod, Flora, Isabella, Florence, those are all streets that are still there today. And then some have changed. So you have Ann Street, which you can see sort of in the kind of middle part of your screen there. That's now Gladstone. John Street, which isn't labeled here, but it's became Cartier. And then Park Avenue is now where it says Flora here on the screen. And so they built this big stadium, and it's got a giant fence around it. It's got a clubhouse, and they do it in record time. And so you kind of wonder, well, why are they building this stadium? Well, it's because, well, actually, I'll jump to that in a second. I can just show you kind of where it is today. So if you were to go to the site of where that stadium was today, this is what you would be seeing. You are kind of looking out towards, if you look further down that corner, you'd see a park in the corner, and it's kind of Cartier, Park Avenue, McLeod, and then Delaware's in there too. So that's roughly where it would have been. So they built a stadium though because the Boston Red Stockings were coming to Ottawa, and this was a big deal for the city. Previously, games had really consisted of the Ottawa Baseball Club, or prior to the Dominion Club, playing other local teams. But now you've got the most famous club in the world coming to Ottawa to play essentially an amateur team. It would be kind of like your office softball team playing the New York Yankees. It was a really big deal, and people were really, really excited about it. It also coincided with a game on that morning. So earlier in the morning, there was a cricket game played at Rideau Hall, so a lot of people were interested in that. And then in the afternoon, they came up to the new stadium to see the Red Stockings and the Ottawa Baseball Club. And they were, all accounts they're really mesmerized by seeing the Red Stockings. So the Red Stockings are pulled in on a sort of horse-drawn bus, and they've got their uniforms, which are the Ottawa team is not really dressed the same way, but the Red Stockings have their red socks on, and they've got their polo or flannel outfits, and so they just look like a professional club. Like the accounts from the newspaper are really glowing of just the athleticism and how graceful they are, and just how little chance they thought that the Ottawa team would have against these professional athletes. Three of the players on the Red Stockings ended up becoming Hall of Famers. So you have Harry Wright, his brother George Wright, and then Albert Spalding, and then you have Ross Barnes, who was the National League batting champion in a few years from here. And it's not close. The Red Stockings beat the Ottawa Baseball Club 64-0. But it really is an important game in Ottawa's history because it gets people excited about the sport in a way that they hadn't been before. It's raised the profile of baseball to a huge degree. And so people are now starting to become a bit baseball crazed in the city. A year later, Boston comes back for a rematch, and Ottawa does a little bit better. They this time they only lose 44-4. So it's a wet day. It's the conditions are not great, but people are still coming out to watch the game, and they're very excited about it. George Latham is the star of the Ottawa team at this point. Excuse me. He's really well praised in the newspaper for his playing. I said basically, he could have fit in just as well on the Boston side as he could have on the Ottawa side. And he went on to have a cup of coffee and with the big league teams, including with the Red Stockings, and he kind of bounced around to a few other places as well. So again, like now Ottawa is baseball crazy at this point by 1873. And you're seeing outside of this game against the Red Stockings, there's now many of these sort of local teams are springing up, and they've got all sorts of very colorful names. Like you've got Mutuals and the Unions and things like that. Pretty typical compared to some, like those would be typical kind of baseball names at the time, but there's lots of clubs like that are starting to pop up around the city. So people are getting really, really into it, and there's lots of games being played, mostly sort of formed by workplaces. So if you're work, at a fire station as a firefighter, you may be on something called the Mutual Club. If you've work at the post office or in the civil service or any of these other places, you may have had a workplace team that you formed. We had our first Ottawa area player to make it to the majors was a gentleman named Jack Humphreys. So he was born in North Gorin in 1861. He didn't live there very long. He only was 5 when they moved to Syracuse. But it's enough to claim for Ottawa to claim him as our first entry into the major leagues. He was a catcher with the New York Gothams and the Washington Nationals. And then in 1883, he made history when he and James O'Neill, Tip O'Neill, were the first Canadian-born batteries, so the first Canadian-born pitcher and catcher to play in a big league game. He went on to play in several other teams, including the Syracuse Stars, the Toronto Canucks, Rochester Maroons, and his son wrote a poem, and his son became a poet, Rolf Humphreys, and he called it Polo Grounds, and the poem mentions his father, which you can see there in bold on the bottom of the screen. So nice tribute to his dad. So where do they play? Well, there's lots of different places around the city where baseball was played. There's the stadium that I showed you earlier. There's makeshift games that are taking place in Sandy Hill and in Lower Town and downtown, what's now downtown. There's some accounts of games on Spark Street at Rito Hall, in Sandy Hill neighborhood. So lots of baseball being played, not a whole lot of places to play it. There's people who are not thrilled necessarily that baseball is happening. So you've got letters in the newspaper at times about people complaining that, it's noisy, or they're playing on Sundays when they're supposed to not be doing anything. It was a Sabbath day for some people. So baseball wasn't supposed to be played, but still people would do it. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the places they played. I'll start at Cartier Square, which is now roughly where City Hall is downtown. So the drill hall at Cartier Square is still there. It's been around. It was a military facility, military drill hall, as you can see here. And there's a large field, and that was really important because it was basically a big open area in the kind of heart of downtown, perfect place to play baseball. And so one of the things about Ottawa is if you wanted to play at Cartier Square, it was owned by the military, the Department of Militia and Defense. And if you wanted to play, you had to ask permission in writing to play there. So very, very bureaucratic. Pictures of Cartier Square. These are from later, 94 and sort of early 1900s. But like I was saying, if you wanted to play there, you had to write a letter. And you had to ask the Minister of Militia and Defense, would it be okay if our baseball club were to practice or play a game on such and such a day between whatever times? And you'd wait. And sometimes you had to ask permission. You had to ask someone who was in a position of power or had some authority to write on your behalf and seek permission for your team to play. And if, it's very relationship driven, if the minister happened to know the person writing on your behalf, there's a very good chance that you would be granted permission to play at Cartier Square. So you can see this Victoria Baseball Club in 1872. This is the first sort of letter that I could find. If you go down to library and archives, there are boxes of these letters from different names of teams. You've got the Victoria Baseball Club. Many years later, you've got the Celtic Benefit Association Club. And then my favorite, the Eclipse Office Furniture Baseball Club of 1899. So you've got all these different groups writing to the minister, seeking permission, asking for a permit to play on Cartier Square. And basically, the answer is usually yes, just don't get in the way of any drills and make sure that you don't interfere with the soldiers. Metropolitan Grounds was another important place for baseball. It was on what was then Jane Street, now Victoria Avenue, basically between O'Connor and Metcalfe Street. And this was controlled by the Ottawa Amateur Athletic Club, which I'll talk about in a little bit later. But so it's a fairly professional grounds. They've got a bicycle race track sort of around the edge of it. And the what were called, you'll see them referred to as the Wanderers, but I'll talk a bit later about their real name. They played briefly there. The Ottawa Rough Riders football team also played there, but the area was sold in 1900, basically similar to what happened to the New Dominion Club. Their grounds were broken up into lots for people living in town. I mentioned the Ottawa Amateur Athletic Club. So this was a group that was established in the late 1880s to basically be the umbrella group for all the city's sports teams. And so, they really wanted to promote physical fitness and mental well-being and be a place for members to come and socialize and have fun community. It was certainly not. It wasn't cheap. You had to pay money to be a member of the club, so there was already sort of a barrier to entry. So not everybody could be a member of the Ottawa Amateur Athletic Club. Women were also allowed to be members, but at sort of a different standing. They weren't able to participate in all the activities, but they were allowed to join sort of at a different tier of membership. And the notable thing about the Ottawa Amateur Athletic Club is they're really the first sports teams that are wearing what are now the familiar red, white, and black that you see in a lot of Ottawa sports teams. And even the forerunner to the original Ottawa Senators hockey team was also affiliated with the Ottawa Amateur Athletic Club. So, if anything, notable more for their contribution to the color scheme for a lot of the Ottawa teams. I talked about the Wanderers, but they weren't really called the Wanderers. As you'll see in a minute, they were actually called the Ottawa Senators. This will be the first time that the nickname Senators was ever used for an Ottawa sports team. But you can take a minute here to look at their uniforms, and I'll tell you a little bit about how those came to be in a minute. But they may be one of the few, if only, teams to ever wear tartan uniforms, which were, you know, I think the Ottawa newspapers said nice things about them. Virtually everybody else did not share the Ottawa newspapers' point of view. So in 1898, Ottawa has had baseball as a very popular activity now for close to 35 years. So it's certainly starting to establish itself, but we hadn't had a professional team. We'd had all these sort of amateur local clubs playing, but never anything in one of the professional leagues. And so in June of 1898, the Ottawa Citizen newspaper starts a campaign, and they start lobbying, and they say, look, there's a lot of other cities around North America that are smaller than Ottawa. They are less affluent than Ottawa, and they have baseball teams. So why doesn't Ottawa have a baseball team? We should have a baseball team. And so they, day after day after day for weeks on end, are just publishing editorials and articles and basically lobbying single-handedly to get get Ottawa a team. Around this time, there's a franchise in Rochester that in the Eastern League that is really struggling. And poor Rochester, because the year before Rochester was in a similar situation, struggling team, and they ended up losing their club to Montreal. And so 1898 comes, Rochester gets a team back. Same story, struggling, really having a hard time. And this lobbying effort from Ottawa is starting to convince that league ownership that maybe relocation would be a good idea for Rochester. Ottawa is one of the teams that emerges as good candidate for relocation, beats out a couple of places in the United States as the destination. And sure enough, in July of 1898, Ottawa is granted the franchise, so the Rochester team moves. Basically, they play a game in Syracuse, and then they've got to rush back, grab their things, jump on a ferry, cross over to Ogdensburg, take the train up to Ottawa. Huge crowd waiting for them at the train station to greet them. There's a big parade. It's a really monumental moment in the city, and they go to Lansdowne Park for the first game, and they are essentially wearing their old Rochester uniforms. So they're these kind of blue uniforms with white lettering on them, but the letterings are all falling off. So depending on which player is wearing which uniform, there's kind of this different collection of letters. So some might just say like Chester, some might just say like Roch, some might say like some combination of these different letters. So it's a really kind of alphabet soup of letters they've got on the uniforms. So they don't look great. But they do well. So they play a couple of games at Lansdowne Park, and then they move to the Metropolitan Grounds, except for on Sundays when they play over in Hull, because you're not allowed playing baseball in Ottawa at that time on Sundays. And very shortly after, a local tailor decides that he's going to make them some new uniforms to replace their sort of falling apart Rochester ones, and that's when you get to see these again, the tartan uniforms that they wear. They're not great. They have sort of they're hovering around 500, so they've won about as many games as they've lost heading into August of 1898. The Citizen even is kind of like not really as excited about this team as they used to be when they were trying to bring them here. People are not going to the games. They're losing a lot of money. The ownership of the club is basically saying to people, look, like if you don't come out and support this team, we're going to have to close it up and maybe not even finish out the season. They end up with a losing record, and then they're disbanded in November. So that's it for the team. In later years, newspaper reports and websites and lots of other places refer to this team as the Wanderers, and that's just not accurate. There's no evidence whatsoever that the team was ever referred to as the Wanderers, either during the time or after or in the years immediately after they left. There's ample evidence that they were called the Senators, and including a Toronto newspaper was the first to suggest it. Said, the Washington Senators are in their nation's capital. Ottawa has a team; they should be the Senators too in Canada's capital. Ottawa sports writers pick up on that, and you see many of these game recaps where they refer to them as the Senators. So a bit of interesting trivia there that the hockey team was not the first team to be called the Senators in Ottawa. It was actually the baseball team. And there's quite a lot of references to them then. Baseball and politics, Ottawa, political town, obviously lots of tie-ins to politics. This was a series of playing cards that were done by the Bain Wagon Company, of showing a number of politicians at the time in different stages of baseball, and some kind of less than flatteringly portrayed here. So you've got Sir John A. Macdonald getting bopped in the nose with the bat there, and a few others that are looking less than, not the best depictions necessarily of them. Tommy Gorman is better known for his time as a hockey player and executive, and he was a gold medalist in lacrosse in 1908 Olympics, but he was a page working on Parliament Hill, and when he was doing that, he played on the Pages baseball team. So he's in this picture here from 1900. I couldn't tell you which one is him, but he is in that picture. So he ended up going on to have quite a distinguished career, Hockey Hall of Fame inductee, but he had a baseball connection in Ottawa, playing on the Pages team. And that's it. So I'll stop sharing my screen. Thanks for your attention, and really happy to take any questions you might have about any of this.
Thank you so much. That was, for me, I found that absolutely fascinating, especially all of the baseball fields. Like I lived down the street from Lansdowne, and that's amazing to see. I mean, I knew that Lansdowne itself was a drill hall at some point during like the wars, so it's just really cool to see how much the city has kind of changed, and some of those spaces are lost. I mean, residential areas are now where the first baseball stadium used to be, and all that kind of stuff.
It's pretty crazy to think, if you go through the Golden Triangle now and you're out for a walk, and you're walking on what used to be, our city's first real stadium. Before there was any hockey arenas or any other baseball stadiums anywhere else, that was the first one. And now, it's houses and apartment buildings and parks.
Well, if anyone has any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat and I can relay them. I'm sure you can see them as well. I actually have a question, just to get it started. I'm really interested in women's sports history. So you mentioned that the Amateur Association, they would have had sort of like the women's tier of membership. Were you able to find out anything more about that, or what their involvement may have looked like?
Yeah, unfortunately, it wasn't typically athletic. It was more of a social activity. So they were allowed to join the club at sort of a lesser tier, but they weren't playing. Certainly, they weren't playing any baseball, or at least that I could find. It was it was entirely the men that were playing, and it seems like it was more of like a social activity, just to be able to join the club and sort of be around other people. So, but it's just not a whole lot that I was able to find on women in baseball generally, and certainly not in Ottawa. There's not a whole lot of there's no evidence I was able to find in the 1800s that was happening. Not to say that it wasn't, but just maybe it wasn't written about.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's some of the earliest reference I've found to women in hockey is in Ottawa, so definitely sports happening. So one question has just come through. Obviously, our early Ottawa team struggled financially a lot. When did we start to see corporate sponsorships of teams or even advertisements on fields, fences, etc.?
It would have came a lot later. In Ottawa, we didn't really so we had some teams in sort of the early 1900s, and then not a whole lot until the 1930s, and then we had AAA teams and things like that. So it was much later before corporate sponsorships kind of came in. Although the Senators team that I talked about was owned by a sort of a brick maker, sort of a very high profile company in Ottawa, and he was the main financial backer of the team. So I guess, kind of corporate ownership there. You had to have some money to be able to start a team, but you also had to be prepared to lose a lot of money at the time. So these were not, just then as now, not typically not a lot of, unless you're one of the big teams, you don't make a lot of money necessarily. And Ottawa was no exception. They estimated about $4,000 at the time for the short season they played. Doesn't sound like a lot of money, but back then it was quite a lot of money to lose $4,000, especially over the span of about 6 weeks. So they were not financially successful at all.
So would the professional teams, would they have been paid through benefactors as well as like ticket sales for the games?
Yeah, so they would have been, so that once they went professional, so when they were playing in the Eastern League, the players were being paid small salary to play, but a lot of them, they weren't getting rich. They weren't making a lot of money doing this.
Mhm. Few more comments here. It is sad that now Ottawa barely supports even an independent league team.
Yeah, I mean it's I think they're making a go of it. One challenge I think that the Titans and some of the previous incarnations in independent baseball have had since the Lynx left is that the stadium was really built too big. Um, it's a 10,000 seat stadium. And when it was built for the Lynx, I think they were anticipating at the time that the city could support 10,000 people a game. But it's a long season, and it's hard to get that many people out to play baseball. And if you're not playing great baseball, that number starts to go down. I wrote a lot about the Lynx coming to the city and then the work that was done to sort of do assessments and studies to figure out what it would take to make a team sustainable and viable in Ottawa. And the number that kept coming up was if you weren't getting at least 2,000 people at a game, you were losing money. And that was one of the reasons that the Lynx ended up leaving the city was because they were just not drawing enough fans to make it viable. And so the challenge I think a lot of these independent teams have is that unlike the Lynx, you don't have players that have the potential maybe of making the major leagues or being called up to the majors. So when you went to see a Lynx game, they were the AAA affiliate of the Expos, and then other teams later on, but primarily the Expos. And so, you got to see players if they were injured and they were on assignment to work their way back from injury, you could see them playing with the Lynx. Or if a player was on their way up, maybe had been drafted and this was their last stop before they made the major leagues, you could see them playing with the Lynx. Or, maybe a player sent down to work on whatever it is they need to work on to get back into the lineup in the majors. So whatever the case may be, you had the potential of maybe seeing a major league player, and that was kind of exciting. But with the independent teams, very few of them actually get, kind of drawn into that pro system where, you have like single A, double A, and all those. Very few get into that system, and the few that do rarely make it to the majors. So there's less potential of seeing, these future stars or current stars on their way down. So a lot of times you're seeing players you don't really know. And the nature of independent baseball is these players don't tend to stick around that long. They may play a season in Ottawa or 2 seasons in Ottawa and then go off somewhere else. So it's hard to develop that attachment to some of these players. It's not like you have, the players that you've known for 5-10 years that just really come to embody baseball in the city. They kind of are very transient. And so it becomes hard to form an attachment. So that's it's one of the downsides of independent ball, but it's a great time if it's cheap tickets and fun way to spend a summer night. So
We just have a point to the earlier one about the sponsorships. I'm particularly interested in the point when companies caught on that sports teams investing was a lucrative avenue. Thank you. And then a question. Thank you. That was super interesting. I work at LAC and I'm curious, what was the most interesting find you've come across at the archives?
I think it was definitely those letters that you had to write to get permission to play at Cartier Square. I found those super interesting because one, some of them are just it's kind of funny to think that if you wanted to go out and play baseball, you had to ask permission, essentially written permission from the government. It's very bureaucratic and very fitting in some ways. So I found that really, really enjoyable. And then you can see the different names of these different clubs coming up. So yeah, you saw the Flips Office Furniture Baseball Club and then these other ones. So you can see like even the lowest level of teams. So essentially this furniture office stores team has to write for permission to play you can't I can't even imagine now if your kind of beer league team or softball team wants to play Brewer Park or something, writing to the minister of whatever to ask permission. It just seems pretty silly, but so I really enjoyed that. And there's some great pictures at Library and Archives that they were awesome to deal with, just really wonderful helping me with research. So yeah, I can't say enough good things about them.
Have many Ottawa area players made it to the MLB?
Yeah, we've had some. We definitely had some. So in the book, we actually have a whole chapter where we talk about a lot of the players that ended up going to the majors. So you've got like Pete Forrest, Phil Beaumont, Eric Bedard, Chris Mears, Jack Humphreys obviously is the first one I mentioned, and there's many more. So Ottawa has had a number of players that went on to play in the majors. So I think we have that nice strong connection, and you can see obviously we have this very long history of baseball here. So yeah, we do have a track record of players in the majors.
Just a comment here. Very interesting. So much history forgotten. And another
Yeah, in
question.
some cases not known, right? Like in a lot of cases with the Ottawa baseball history, it's until we started really working on the book and doing all this research, not a ton was really known about it. I mean, there'd been obviously a lot of research done by some of my colleagues, like Gary, who's on the call here, and David Donald and others have done some fantastic work looking to early Ottawa. But I think for the general public, a lot of people are just unaware of the fact that we've had baseball here for as long as we had.
Well, a question from Gary. What's this I hear about an SABR book on the history of baseball in Ottawa? Tell us more.
Well, funny you should ask. So no, this is a book that came together over the last year. So Gary contributed a number of chapters to it as well. And so essentially, it was a combination of folks who were in the Society for American Baseball Research, as well as a number of local journalists who were just interested in baseball. And last January, so January 2024, we had, or I'd approached Sabre and said, I think Ottawa's got a great history. It's underlooked, and I think it would make a great book. And they agreed, and so they said, okay, we'll publish it. And so we came together, and I got a lot of people together, and we ended up putting it out it took about a year. So it was published just at the beginning of February. So very quick turnaround, but yeah, it's great. So if you're interested in the early baseball history like I am, there's lots in there. If you're interested in some of the um, the middle parts of the 1900s, lots of stuff in there for you. And if you like the links, there's tons of stuff on the links in there, including some potential stadium spots that were looked at before they ended up using the place on Coventry Road. So a lot of sort of what could have been in there.
And just another comment. Very interesting. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you.
I think if there's any last questions that people have, feel free to add them to the chat. And if not, I think we're almost at time.
Yeah, I think maybe I'll just say too that it's it was great for me to see the first game being held in Metcalfe. So I'm from Osgood originally, and so it was quite nice to read that and see that just down the street from, well, a little bit further than that, but a very short car ride away. Baseball would have been first documented in Metcalfe. So I thought that was great, and the fact that I'm getting to do the opportunity to speak here with the Osgood Township Museum is also very kind of a nice way to pay tribute to that.
No, well, thank you so much. It's really interesting. And I mean, Metcalfe is a 10-minute drive from the museum, so that connection is just incredible. And we have, like I mentioned earlier, a few baseball related artifacts that we have on display at the museum right now, including two baseball bats that have definitely seen better days. Oh, just a few more comments here. Great talk, really informative. Thanks so much. Thank you also to the museum for organizing. Thank you so much. This was a great evening. Oh, personal question. Did you grow up Expos or Blue Jays?
So my first game that I ever went to was a Expos game. So I was actually born in Montreal and then spent the first 8 years of my life living in Montreal. And I have a very fuzzy memory of going to see a game at the Big O when I was, I guess, it would have been before I was 8. I don't remember who was playing. I don't remember who won. I just remember sort of the yellow roof of the building. That's the only thing that really stands out to me. But since then, I've seen many more Jays games. So yeah, I'd be a Jays fan.
And then also thank you for a great presentation, Steve. So
My pleasure.
there we have it. So yeah, I guess we'll wrap it up for tonight. Again, thank you so much for coming, and I'm so glad that everyone enjoyed it. I know we certainly did, and we're always looking for the local history connections with the museum for sure. And it's so fun to have such a dynamic and interesting topic that, as many have pointed out, maybe is not as well known, especially if you're a historian into very niche topics. It's really exciting to be able to share. So thank you again, Steve, for coming tonight, and thank you everyone as well.
Thank you so much.